Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So now, to follow on from our discussion and picking up on questions, when are we ready? When should we move forward? What is our technology development stage at? Commonly, you look at fundamental research, then there is research and development, then you look at pilot and demonstration projects, and then you finally think about early adoption, where I had initiated or indicated that innovation is when consumers, your product is launched on the market and people are buying it or people are adopting that technology, product or service, which is the rare thing. Okay, so of course there is technology readiness levels, and I'm sure that many of you would have come across technology readiness levels before. This session or this part of the day today is going to be very detailed, and so TRLs you will find enough and more resources. So I will basically, I'm not going to be reading. I know that having for many years been a student myself, reading from slides is not very conducive to them. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I will signal some of the key points or things that we can look at. I will try to provide, or I will try to provide the links. So in fundamental research, what you will notice is that you have this TRL levels where you look at your own project or your own technology and say, is it just basic principles? Are you doing some applied research? Is there any experimental proof of concept? Is there the validation in a lab environment, right? So which is TRL4. And each of these are ways in which, when you are applying for research grants nationally or internationally, people will try to understand at what stage, how far have you come along in that journey. And a lot of this journey, as I have mentioned before, is happening in the university or research institute, in the lab, right? You might be working alone, you might be working with a professor or faculty member or a group of students, as the case may be. So you are exploring. This might be part of a capstone project or your thesis project and so on, right? So this is one way to sort of try and assess what your technology development stage is. Further on, it goes up to 9, and it looks at validation of semi-integrated components in a similar environment, in a simulated environment. So what you're trying to do basically is, one of the big leaps is you find something that works in a lab, and yet when you take it outside the lab, things don't work. Or then suddenly you discover that there are 20 different parameters that you hadn't thought of. And then you come back and there is optimization, and over time you characterize and improve and so on. So unless investors will tend to value things that are closer to real world conditions. Success in the lab is perhaps good for publishing, but success in real world conditions is what gets you towards funding and eventual adoption at some point. So validation and pilots and demonstrations to try and get to as close to real world conditions. Now, one thing to remember here is, suppose your technology can go in 3 different directions. You can go after market A, market B, market C. You might have your technology is doing well with market A in real world conditions, but for B and C, it works in the lab but does not work in the field, right? That will then give you some indication that, okay, where should I go? What traction? Now, that doesn't mean that the problem is solved. What about competition? We'll get to that later, right? But at this stage, the focus of technology readiness levels is on your own technology. You're not looking at market, you're not looking at competition. You're just saying, okay, how much work remains to be done? How close are we to real world conditions? So my university is located in an agricultural area. So we have a lot of farmers there all around us and a lot of berry farmers. So you've got of blueberries, strawberries, blackberries. Now, one of the challenges, and this is common in agriculture more broadly, is many of these fruits require manual labor to pluck. Okay? And manual labor is very hard to come by and is very expensive. So what typically happens? You get temporary workers from other countries like Mexico, from South America. They are coming in during the summer for short periods on some visas to pluck and then. So real world problem. Lots of farmers, berry farmers in all parts or most two sides of Canada. Huge volumes, all dependent on manual picking. So I have worked with researchers who are looking to automate. Now, one way of automation, some machines that exist is these berries grow on bushes. So some machines are there, the size of combine harvesters. These bushes will be lined in parallel columns. And the machine will go and capture 3 or 4 simultaneously, will shake the bushes, and whatever falls, there is a conveyor belt and capture. Now, in that shaking, there is a lot of waste, a lot of loss. That is part of it. So some researchers that I know and have talked to, they are trying to design robots who can pluck like this, like humans. Now, what are humans doing? The question is, it is partly an imaging problem because you're looking and seeing which is right, which is not right. Second is blueberries, strawberries, all of these are very delicate fruits. You cannot squeeze it too much, it will destroy the fruit. You cannot do it too lightly. It has to be just the right pressure. So the timing. Third thing from agriculture point of view is you have hundreds if not thousands of farmers. All of those farmers will need berry picking machines for a 3-week period in summer. So harvesting is not staggered. All the produce will get ripe during the same time of the year. So all of those 100 if not thousands of farmers, small farmers, large farmers, need that equipment just for the 3-week period or 4-week period. And rest of the year they don't want that, they don't need that machine. So how then do you design an automated system which has the imaging component, which has the mechatronic component, which can be scaled and can be designed in a size that works for small farms and large farms, can work for different kinds of berries, and then can be given as a lease or in some financing system that allows most of these people to say yes. So that solution has not yet fully been in place. So up till now, the machines at least that I have seen are shaking the bushes and collecting to conveyor belts and then packaging. So this is the real world application. So if you look at it from a lab or a scientist perspective, there might be one scientist or computer scientist specialist, and I know several myself, who are focused just on the imaging side. That is their whole lab, just imaging. There are others who are working just on the plucking side. They don't necessarily talk to each other. They are independent research projects and students and doing their project, not necessarily connected. But what does the market or the farmer need? The market needs both capabilities as well as the business and finance person to say what is going to be cost effective. And then all of it has to work in British Columbia's climate, which is rainy. So the soil is soggy and it's not easy to have it move. And so there is a gap between what humans can provide and what machines are currently able to do. But then all of this basic research funded by public taxpayer funds are trying to develop a solution which will take years, right? And because this harvest season is typically not more than one, sometimes it might, for some crops, it might be 2 times a year. When is your time to test? You can basically, that means test only once or 2 times a year, right? Rest of the year you are developing in the lab, but you don't have the opportunity to test. So for ag products and ag technology like these, the testing of that is dependent on the season and the harvesting time, right? It's just not saying that, okay, in the lab, we decided 3 months, 6 months, this is our target. No, you have to look at how the farms and farmers, how they work and how it aligns with your activity. Okay, all of this to give so much detail on what is possible on pilots and demonstration projects. And then at some stage, you reach this prototype systems and actual technology completed. In all of these, you will also have the, say, biotech and other sectors, you will have the regulatory environment and all of the other hurdles and health authority hurdles. Even when you clear, say, FDA trials, you might have, once your product is there, then getting it through different health authority procurement processes is again another layer to getting a product on the market. And then finally, you get to that early adoption, which is people are actually having your product, they are able to use your product. So often this journey, go back to your slide, from TRL level 1 to 3 onwards up till 8 or 9 will take at least a couple of years. You are being pragmatic. And so as scientists, you should really understand where you are today and how much work remains to be done. That will then, again, like I said, feed into who are the other people you need to have on your team, what kind of incubation programs or mentorship or initiatives you need to be part of, what resources will they provide to you. That will help you refine your idea further into. And you need to be incredibly passionate and believing in it to stick with it through this process, through ups and downs. The other part which links to the founder side of things and team building, and again, I'm sort of sharing some other material that I'll talk about in more detail next week, is it seems that people find it easier to work together when a lot of money is not being made. When revenues start flowing after many, many years, then sometimes you can have questions as to why is somebody getting so much, why is somebody not getting so much, right? So there have been instances where nobody worries, there is no competition, nobody is looking about you or thinking about your technology because you're a small startup. But when you really have done all of this hard work, you took the risk, and after several years, you really started making money, and you really started taking business from a larger or much larger player in the industry. Then they will say, okay, can we file a case against you? How can we either acquire that small company? How can we get them into litigation, and these kind of things happen. So, and for your founder team also, sometimes when there is no money, everybody is working really hard and everything is fine. And sometimes when funds start to flow in, if you haven't had those discussions and laid everything out clearly, if you haven't done that, and there is some ambiguity, then that can be some challenges later, where things were not clear, who was contributing how much and how that played. But there are some ways, there are studies again done on these kind of things, and there are some ways in which you can try to minimize. Nothing can be perfect, but at least you can try to be better prepared. Yeah, so before even I get into the question on TRL, there are a couple of things. So one is in IP, there is, and there'll be an IP specialist with you next week, and he will speak into it in more detail. But there is a term called freedom to operate, which speaks to, for these other bits of technology that exist, other people might have patents already on them, right? So before you do or explore that kind of integration, you should understand what they have. Suppose you are developing something, the end result of which is already a patent belonging to somebody else. That is one aspect to consider. The second thing which has implications is, I have talked to scientists and engineers who sometimes say, well, there is this larger equipment which is not very efficient. And I have this small widget or something that I'm making, maybe a software, maybe some hardware component. If I attach it to this larger machine, that makes it much better. So common sense would suggest that the user will see it as very useful, that they already have that large machine, they buy this 200 rupee or dollar thing, that makes their job so much easier. Maybe, for example, a 3D printer exists and you add something, software or hardware, that makes it print a lot faster. 3D printers are slow at times. And so the question then is, unless you are working with the original manufacturer of the 3D printer, typically sometimes their agreements or warranty agreements have some clause which say, if you modify it with some part that is not approved by us, that will void the warranty. Then you will find that, and this I have encountered with healthcare and other things, where scientists say that, well, I've designed something that should help improve MRI scanners or something like that. Well, if you bought it for a couple of $1 million, you are not going to void that warranty just because somebody came up with a small amount. So there is an FTO, or freedom to operate aspect, which is, will you have eventually an intellectual property protection that allows you to have a company? Because unless you solve that problem, you may not have a startup, which if you form a startup, it may not get funds, which means that it won't go anywhere, because unless you solve that kind of a problem. The other side is, if you have these attachment kind of things, unless you are doing it in partnership with some of the larger companies in some form, it can be a challenge. I also have an example for example, again related to 3D printing, where a school student in British Columbia, for a hobby, his family gave him a 3D printer, and he discovered, like many of us, the 3D printers are incredibly quite slow. So you wanted to print a little faster. He designed some software where he could group a couple of 3D printers together and give a common command so that it works faster, and the total output that you need is some. So he did that over a couple of years, 1 or 2 years. The idea was so interesting that some Japanese company reached out to him and said, we want to license your technology. And he was still in school, which meant that he was under 18, which meant that under many of the Canadian laws, he couldn't be a director, he couldn't be a founder because he was too young, right? So there are instances where sometimes it can align. So I won't say it is zero, but I will say that it's very case specific, and you have to investigate many aspects. On the TRL level, some of the guidance that is available, which I'll come on to the next slide, which sort of anticipated this question, speaks to TRL levels are linked to market application. So in some market application, you might be at TRL level 6. In another market application, you might be at 3. Right? So it depends on what kind of testing and how close you are to real world conditions. So that is that TRL for that application. So you need to be more specific, and that's again, when you do any due diligence and investors and people will ask you, and I have been part of many pitch competitions for these kind of events, and many industry specialists will come who are scientists themselves and who are now VC and angel investors. They will ask very specific questions on the technology and say, okay, how can you show us that you are at that TRL? So even saying you are at a particular TRL is not easy. You have to have a lot of evidence. Okay. So guiding principles to assess TRL, start with the broader technology development stage, which was fundamental research and So first start with these and then get to the more specific ones. If there are any uncertainties, if you cannot answer yourself very clearly that, yeah, we are at prototype level, we are at pilot level, and so on. If you have uncertainty, go for the lower level because you don't have the evidence for the higher level. Ensure that the operating environment is well understood to be clear about real world conditions and how the testing environment in the lab or simulated or operational, how close is your testing environment to real world conditions. Then, this was the point you were asking. A TRL is only valid for the specific operational environment for which it was tested. If it has multiple applications, it is further along in one, but not so much in some other. If a developed technology is to be deployed, different from the one that it was tested for, the technology would no longer be considered fully developed and would need to be tested in that other application to get that developed. Important distinction, a technology is said to have achieved a specific TRL if it has met the requirements for that level and all earlier levels. That would be the logical thing. Right? So if you say it is at TRL level 6, that means it has done everything up to 6, including 6. Okay, so that was about TRLs. Now the important thing here is the first word, technology. We are not thinking about market at all. They're just saying technology, lab, this is what we did, this is the data that we got, not necessarily thinking about market. So the US Department of Energy has come up with something called adoption readiness levels. But before I get into that, I will show you this, this sort of example from a research paper which talks about graphene, advanced material, and all of the different applications which might be in OLED lighting, it might be in sensors, it might be DNA sequencing, all of these different applications, market applications of graphenes across so many different disciplines at various TRL levels. Now again, this is some researchers who have studied that domain as scientists and engineers and have tried to map to the best of their ability. Now this was done in 2014. We are in 2025. Hopefully they would have moved further along on at least a couple of them. But this is just indicative of how one platform technology or one advanced material can have so many different applications. And therefore, if you are working in that kind of a field, you would have to decide, well, should I go after OLED lighting or should I go for sensors? If I'm going for sensors, is it going to target, say, an ag market? Is it going to say a biotherapeutic, or what kind of radio pharmaceutical, or what kind of sensor are we designing? So there is a lot of detail or nuance that is needed. Okay. So like I said, up to now, technology readiness levels looked at technical risks. But those are not the only risks. There are so many risks on the market. Competition, regulations, and otherwise. So the US Department of Energy has come up with adoption readiness levels and related it to technology readiness levels. So if you look at it, TRLs look at only look straight. You're looking at TRL 3, 6, 9. But they're not necessarily, they are assuming that if you solve all the technology problems, people will buy it. But as we now know from all the examples we discussed, just because you solve all the technical problems does not mean that people will go ahead and buy your product. So you really have to understand, again, the user. Are you solving their problem? So adoption readiness level has several risk dimensions. Again, all of these are easily available, but I will talk about, say, market size. So when you're looking at raising funds, if you need to raise funds, which of course many ideas, they will need some additional funding. You cannot do it out of your own pocket. what will happen is if you raise funds, they will look at, well, is it a large market? Is it a growing market? Can you sell it in India and in Indonesia, in South Africa, in the US and Canada? Do you have intellectual property protection in all these markets? Do you have partnerships in these markets? What is your go-to-market strategy? So you will have all of these kind of questions. If you say that, well, my solution is something that only works for one part of one country or one small niche discipline, niche area, then the chances are that investors may not perceive, even if it does everything technologically well, it is not a big enough market. I have a research paper done in 2014 with collaborators who were looking at cancer therapeutics. So trying to develop a cure for one particular kind of cancer. Now, in the mid 80s or late 80s, when that technology was being developed, the scientists were solving the technology problem and they came up with personalized cancer therapeutics. Like now we are talking about personalized cancer medications. Like they will track your individual cancer and try to tweak the medication to cure your kind of cancer in your body, not a generic medicine. There are some personalized therapies that are being explored and tried out in testing. Now, what happened with this technology was that the inventors and founders of that startup, they developed some personalized cancer therapy in mid to late 80s. And they were reasonably close to or almost close to solving the technical problem. What they missed was, when they looked at the cost for that, 1980s or mid 80s, late 80s, the cost was over 100,000 US dollars in late 80s. Who will pay that, right? Even if you solve that problem, insurance companies won't pay it. Governments won't pay it. Patients, of course, can't pay it. So even when you have solved the problem or are very close to solving the problem, there is no market because you cannot sell it. So one other CEO who came into that startup, he said that we have to really rework our strategy and change it from being a personalized therapy for every individual patient and change it to something common that can be given to broader set of patients, and therefore the cost per medication or therapy will come down drastically. When they did that, it became $1 billion success. However, the founders were not happy. The scientists were not happy. They said that's not what we wanted to make. So sometimes you can have a divergence in strategy between the vision of the founders who wanted the best technologically advanced solution versus the vision from a business or market perspective is, well, how do we make something that people will buy? And there is a whole research paper with a case study with all of those details. I can share it. So all of this to indicate that there are very many different challenges. Let us look now, we have a couple of minutes, let us look at some of the challenges that I have paraphrased. So what are risk areas? Sometimes what you are developing compared to what is on the market, it is more expensive. Of course, if you do something like that, of course, in the Indian market, the chances of survival are very low in particular. Then there is no clear pathway to cost competitiveness. Okay, let us assume it is more expensive for now, but you have a way to bring down the cost. But if there is no clear way to bring down the cost, then even though you have technically solved the problem, nobody is going to buy. Second, for the product already on the market, your solution solves part of the problem, but not the whole problem. And so it has poorer functionality. Then of course, why should anybody go for your product? Then, poor risk area, like the one that I was talking about, the honeybees and pollinators. Sometimes some technology solutions mean that people have to be given significant training. So you know about the Boeing plane disasters? Have you read about MCAS, their system? Part of the things that are emerging from some of their documents, it seems to suggest that they added a feature to the navigation to the systems of their newer models of their plane, but they did not convey it. They did not convey to authorities that this was new and a major modification, because had they said it was new and a major modification, many, almost all of the pilots would have to be retrained. Pilot retraining means that it is taking them time away from flying, which has significant economic implications. So they said, let us add this thing, but don't tell anybody. Retraining costs. And of course, we know what's the implication of those things, right? That's a very significant example. But that is how sometimes economic factors can sometimes impact technology commercialization. And therefore, the need for regulatory oversight and regulatory enforcement. You know about that, with the Titan submarine that imploded off the coast of Canada? Again, seems highly innovative, new kind of shell, new advanced material, very limited regulatory oversight. So all of this to say that innovation is needed. It is needed for technological growth. It is needed for improving societies and living standards. But there is some value in maintaining regulatory oversight at acceptable levels. Now that is the challenge. How do you define what is acceptable? How do you define that at the level of what I should say is clear? Many of the scientists, entrepreneurs, and CEOs that I've talked to, what they struggle with is rules and regulations which are unclear and ambiguous. They struggle with processes that don't give a clear timeline. They struggle with regulations that don't have clearly defined metrics of success. When you have those gray areas, what that does is it does not give clarity as to, well, will my app, if I put this package in, will it get approved? Without that approval, I cannot have my drone business. Without that approval, I cannot have my therapeutic or orthopedic product on the market. But the regulations itself, if they are not there, not clear. I have worked also with clean tech companies or working on green hydrogen, and sometimes the answer is, well, the standards are not yet in place. There are no standards. How can you get approval when the standard has not been made? So then it's the companies themselves that propose some standards and say, and then those processes are there. Okay, so incumbent advantages and market barriers to entry. Sometimes the market itself is too small. Or I was at Xerox Park, Palo Alto Research Center, many years ago. And one of the things that VP R&D at the time said was that there are technologies we have not yet patented, because patents typically have a term of 20 years in most cases, because we feel that some of these technologies, there still will not be a market after 20 years. So we are not patenting and publicly divulging that yet. So there are those kind of things also in place. So when there are technologies, inventions that are waiting for markets to emerge, they are waiting for conditions to emerge. Sometimes you have non-existence or existent or highly fragmented value chains. We have a session on industry value chains that I will give you some more examples later. But all of this to say that when you are selling, sometimes you're not selling to the end customer, you are selling to other people who are businesses. And therefore, you are expecting them to adopt what you provide. And so you have to really understand what standards are they operating under, what regulatory requirements are needed there, what are the procurement processes. And sometimes all of that is not clear. Again, for green hydrogen, no point making green hydrogen if there is no storage technology for green hydrogen. There is no transportation technology. You can have a manufacturing unit making green hydrogen, but how does it get transferred to another location for use in some other industry? If storage and transportation is not in place, then what you make is not going to get utilized. You have to understand that. Then sometimes significant additional investment is needed. Deployment requires new or significantly improved processes compared to industry status quo. So here I talk about, say, the chemical industry, the steel industry, or the concrete making and things like that, which are old, very established industries, power generation, where things are not easy to change because there has been so much investment in older technologies that it's very difficult to change all of that. Right? And you cannot do piecemeal changes. And so sometimes you run up, as a startup, you run up against some very established player. Look at the energy sector in the US and in other places. Energy utilities. You cannot easily compete against energy utilities because they are almost monopolies. Like they are the ones, they control transmission and distribution. Everything you do will flow through them. So unless you agree or work with them or there is some political pressure or something, it's not easy to make some of your clean tech or newer renewable energy technologies go through. And therefore, in Europe or in some other countries, you might get more traction. In US or some other jurisdiction, maybe depending on various governments who is in power, who is not, sometimes you may get a lot of support, sometimes you may get zero support. Deployment, if it requires creation of new manufacturing processes, that can also be a challenge. And then one thing that is emerging more and more, and I'm sure some of you would have come across that. Have you come across the term critical raw materials for batteries, and how sometimes the value chains indicate that wherever the mining takes place, all the processing is done in one country, and therefore it's a bottleneck, it's a challenge. So sometimes that can be a problem. You are developing something, but the only way to take that technology forward is working with another country or working with a company from another country that currently is not possible for various geopolitical reasons. So you have to map out those kind of things. And remember, all of what we discussed was not in technology readiness. Right? So technology readiness work, I do this in the lab, this is the prototype. At the most, I'm looking at simulating in real world conditions as much as possible. None of these factors were being looked at. And yet, these factors need to be thought of and addressed as much as possible. Because otherwise, your product faces a much, much more significant challenge. You won't even be close to customers for it. Customers buying product. And then finally, you have deployment only with major changes to regulations. So regulations are not there, or existing regulations are not aligned to your technology. Again, look at drones, defense application, but then you cannot fly over airports with drone delivery is a challenge. It's not so much that you cannot fly drones or you cannot deliver things with drones, but there will be many, many regulatory challenges depending upon different countries. Some countries might have got the regulations, other countries not so much. And of course, then you get into the more specifics on manufacturing, which is permitting and siting, like environmental approvals and all of that to set up a manufacturing facility as the case may be. Significant potential for environmental degradation. Sometimes the technology that you are advancing might have some negative side effects also, might have some positive benefits, but typically many things don't always only have positive impacts, there can be negative impacts also. Then there are times when some technologies don't get approved because the public is against it, right? For whatever reason. And so you might think as a startup or a technology person that, well, this is obviously, this is in the best interest, this is the best technical solution, this has market acceptance and all of that. And certainly there is some other challenge that is more difficult to anticipate. And there are enough and more examples both from India and elsewhere. One example of challenges is, you know about PFAS, for fluorocarbons, and what emerged initially as water repellent coatings and significant health challenges that are now emerging from that technology solution, which was initially used for defense to prevent rusting in army vehicles, and then realized that it could be used as Teflon or it could be used as coating for non-stick cookware. But now it's turning out to have very, very significant health effects or negative health impacts. Right? Sometimes these impacts emerge over time and can be very, very challenging. Okay, so some examples of graphene technologies, again from that paper. Factors that slow adoption can be moving from lab scale, so moving from say a 5-gram, 10-gram scale to a 10 kilogram scale. That's a significant challenge. The costs, even when you make large volumes, will it be cost effective? Storage and transport can be a challenge, especially for advanced materials. Resistance by current technologies can be a challenge. Why would people want to change? For anybody thinking about being an innovator, people don't like change, right? So any organization that you join, any organization that you partner with, convincing people to change is not easy. There has to be a very foolproof idea that, well, what you are doing costs 100 rupees. I can do it in 10 rupees. Then people will think about it. Right? But there has to be such a significant advantage that people are forced to choose. Otherwise, making that choice to change is not easy. I have examples of doctors who use surgical staplers, and there is written documentation available saying that, well, doctors prefer a certain brand, even if it is more expensive. The health authority or the private payer wants them to adopt a newer technology which is lower cost, better quality, and more effective. But doctors are just used to that particular, right? It is nothing to do with technical factors. It is nothing to do with cost factors. It is just human behavior. How can you change that, right? So then it is more of a challenge. So you have to truly understand all of these different layers. You have to have the technical answer. You have to have a procurement answer. If you have a finance person, the finance person should see the logic. The doctor should see the logic for that one innovation. And health and safety factors for graphene. What can be factors accelerating adoption of graphene technologies? Can be standardization. If standards are there, it makes it easier for you to say, well, we've got so and so certification that allows us the ability to store, to transport, to use. Customer-led integration. Sometimes the economic logic is so strong that people will themselves say, let us find a way to integrate. That can happen. Look at solar PV cells. When they started many, many years ago, not technically efficient, not cost effective, and now over time, over so many years, it is now so much more feasible. There are so many places that are niche applications. So for graphene and others, there might be not maybe the largest market, there might be some niche applications where they are so far ahead of the rest that it makes economic sense to have a startup solve that. Drone delivery. Now, this is not necessarily, I wouldn't characterize it as science-based, but I thought this would be, as technologists, you would be interested in. Some challenges with drone and drone delivery, which are being observed is, well, limited load capacity. So there are only certain sizes or weights, limited range for now. Cost per delivery has to be calculated. For companies like Walmart or Amazon, which are trying these things out, sometimes they are discovering at the moment the cost of the delivery sometimes exceeds the cost of the product, which then doesn't make economic sense. Then people can have noise complaints. People will say, I don't want drones landing or taking off near me. It's all of these challenges. So there are studies on that. And look at drone applications. So experts were surveyed on what can be some of the challenges or ways in which drones can be utilized. So it can be used for disasters, for identifying location and state of victims around burn sites or flooding sites, as the case may be, mapping geographical areas after a landslide to support reconstruction, surveying power grids to ensure reliable electricity supply or wildfires, as the case may be, and locating birds or other animals and things like that. So all of these are indicators of one technology, drones, targeting all of these different problems. So as a scientist entrepreneur, you may have to choose which one should I go for first. Where is the best potential to get revenues from? And once you generate some revenues, then you can raise more funding, then you can go after something you really wanted to do. But first you want to target some application where you can quickly generate something. And there are, of course, with every application, there can also be challenges. Well, drones can be used in illegal applications and people don't want that. There can be regulatory challenges. They can be misused. There can be accidents. They can be used for surveillance, which harms or the privacy of individuals and so on. Right? So whenever you are developing your technology, you have to anticipate what might be potential objections, what might be potential challenges, and how do you communicate the value of what you are doing, the economic value as well as the society value. So this has been a very broad overview of one, how much time it can take, how many people need to be involved over time, what are the range of challenges, whether it is technology development from the lab to the market, and in the market, what are some of those challenges that you might face. So all of those are the things that we have looked at today. So with that, some of the questions, if you want to focus on that in the afternoon today, on your own time, can be think about your own technology solution. How would you characterize the TRL of your solution? Given what you know of TRLs, is it 3 or 4 or 7? And then, what barriers do you anticipate? Given what you know now, what barriers do you anticipate for your technology? Technical barriers, market barriers, and what can be your plan to mitigate those barriers? How will you try to solve it? And it's quite possible you may not have all of the answers today, but it is important you think about these questions. Yeah, and that is like it will come with some exploration of different potential conditions. So what I have seen is, like I said when I started in my intro, is I worked with, I would say, maybe a couple of hundred scientists and engineers, each of whom is trying to commercialize their technologies. And what they find is sometimes it is in groups like these where you say that, well, I'm developing a drone technology, or give a little bit, maybe 2 sentences about what you do. And someone from another discipline might say that, oh, it looks like what you are doing can solve a problem in my field. And that may not even have been on your radar at all. Right? So what I would say is don't necessarily share how you are solving a problem, so which is your intellectual property part of it, but give a general broad description of what area you are working on. And in these kind of domains, you might uncover some applications. That said, once you have that, you would also want to then engage in some of the ARL level questions to decide in your ecosystem, for example, in some of your applications in India as of today. Are you finding VCs are investing in, say, suppose one application is in healthcare, one application is in tech for some. Are you finding that it's more easy to get to the market in, say, clean tech versus biotech, right? So you will need to look at some of those areas before making a choice. The advantage of India in some sense is that, like I said, Western societies are quite significantly regulated. At times you will find here is that there are regulations, but there are still limited regulations. There is more options you can try. In fact, there are groups of US medical doctors who are coming to India to do things because they say that in the US we cannot even visualize being able to do these things that are much more possible here, right? So you have to evaluate your market application assessment through the lens of what is practically feasible. And it might be possible that you might uncover that if you are really keenly interested in doing something, the way to move forward might be outside India. Right? So your choice, but you have to do some groundwork before taking an answer. I cannot give you a yes or no answer without understanding it. And even then, I would point you to some resources at the most, but you would be the person to take that decision. Some of the sessions that we'll have in this week will help you unpack further some ways to answer this. Okay, so when you talk about defense and government, they are related but slightly different in the way things work. So defense, given the current geopolitical situation, things are opening up more in defense across the world. That is one thing. Second, you should look at an organization called DARPA if you're not already aware of it. And they have already programs and all. The history of a lot of technology development in the United States is that there are times when things start off as defense applications, then come into consumer markets later, like the water repellent coating that I was mentioning. There are many like that. There are also programs like SBIR and STPR in the United States, which sort of incentivize small companies by saying that ministries and defense units will procure from small startups, innovative small startups. A portion of the budget of these ministries is dedicated to procuring from small companies. So I would characterize that sometimes defense sectors in some countries actually are more supportive of it. So they are the first step. Typically, funders or investors look at traction and they say, well, how many paying customers have you got, right? And so defense and SBIR, STPR, these tend to be that first customer for some innovative stuff, at least in the US. It is hoped that similar or these kind of programs will also emerge in other countries where there will be some level of procurement. Procurement is an underappreciated avenue of support for startups. So government is a big buyer of many things across many different things. If government procurement can be supportive of innovation and innovative startups, that gives these startups that first customer. Maybe it's a small order, not a very large order, but at least there is a path. That has been the experience of some initiatives in the United States. Other countries have tried to emulate it. So I wouldn't say that, well, defense is more challenging. Of course, there will be very specific requirements. I was 2 weeks back in a conversation with a Canadian SME which supplies different flotation devices for defense purposes used by special forces. So the requirements of special forces are very different from what you would need if you go to a city. So it is much more intensive, but when a company has that capability, then of course they can target a much larger consumer market later with something similar. And so that's the way to go. Government procurement, on the other hand, is more challenging everywhere across. Defense procurement, it is probably going to be more open in many parts of the world.